Okay, and welcome back. This is part 2 of our database and SQL Plus series. Now, where we left off, it was a slightly ominous note, and I said that there are rules that we have to follow when it comes to working with databases. And I don't want to discourage, by any means, you from thinking that working with databases has to be hard. It's just more a question of if we're working with databases and we're doing it right, there are some rules that we have to follow. But just to prove a small point here, let's imagine for a second that instead of writing to this track table right here, we're actually writing to a different table, right? One where you don't have all these rules. If that was the case, all I'd have to do is just change the name of the table, maybe just say track new. And as long as I had a table called track new right here, this insert would work beautifully, right? Because we'd have fewer rules. So just writing to the database is as simple as that. As a matter of fact, we can actually prove this. Let me just get rid of track new, and let me actually delete this row right here that was causing our problems. And now let's just run this form again. So now we're going to try to insert this new track where it has 0 and 0 and 0 for track ID, artist ID, and elm ID. You can see that I didn't get a message of an error this time. And indeed, when I refresh my database table here, you can see that here's our new track, right? So just to review very briefly, when it comes to writing queries, we went in and named our form field values the same as what our database column names were. Then I went to the SQL Plus module right here, and I modified my insert statement to match up with the table that I want to write to, in this case track. I then, in these first set of parentheses, put the two the two column names, track name and value and time, and then I used the dynamic variable picker to insert those two columns. I do want to cover real quickly, however, there is an easier way of doing this in rack forms and newer, and that is using the SQL Plus Automator. So let me go ahead and delete this SQL Plus item right here, and let me go back up to our first page. I'm going to right click anywhere on my form page, and I'm going to select under SQL Plus Automator the MySQL option. This launches a wizard, the SQL Plus Automator wizard, and its job now is to walk us through the process of creating all these things that we had to write by hand before. So the first thing I fill out is table name. So in this case, the table name that I want to work to or write to is track, as we recall. So remember, it's track right here. And the database name is music, and then here is my other login information. So that all looks good. And I essentially want to do then is I want rack forms to write that SQL statement for me. So all I'm doing here is I've right-clicked, I said SQL Plus Automator, I've put in my database information. I'm not going to change anything else about this. I'm just going to go down to this Insert Actions right here and click SQL Plus Insert Item. What that's going to do now, you can see that the process is completed successfully. What this has essentially done is what we had to write by hand before, right? It's gone in and it said insert into track name, artist ID, like all those columns. It's put in the appropriate number of question marks, and it's even filled in the variables that we want to use as well. Now, it should be said, of course, that in our handwritten query, I only had those two form fields, right? We only wrote track name and time. Here, it went through and created fields for all of our fields. If I wanted to, I could go back into my SQL Plus Automator here, select MySQL again, and actually delete those fields that I don't want to write. So I don't want to write artisan ID and album ID. I just want track name and time. If I do that, let's put in track as our table name again. When I do that now, I can create an SQL Plus insert item right here. Reforms went ahead and created a second one for me, but this time it restricts it to just track name and time. Right? So it's doing that for us right there. Now, the important part about the last video where we kind of left off was I did say that we had some issues that we had to deal with when it comes to working with databases. And what that issue really comes down to here is that we have something called a primary key restraint on this column, or in this table, that says that I need to have a unique track ID, artist ID, and elm ID. They can't all be the same. I can't have a second entry now that has 0, 0, and 0 for all three of these. And so that means whoever designed these series of database tables right here intended all of these database tables to work together. And that's one of the most important things about this now, is that we can't think of most database jobs in a vacuum. We have to think about related data. And really when it comes down to this job, if I could just expand just for a moment here, if you really think about this, let's say we're using this for a DJ service, right? You hire a DJ for your wedding, and you want them to play tracks for you. And so this web interface now that we're building essentially allows our DJ to add new tracks to his list of tracks that he has. Now, the only way that would really be useful, if we think about it, is if we could further refine that search by artist and album, right? So if we just had a giant list of songs, that DJ might search for Hotel California, right? Now, most likely, he's only going to get the Eagles version of Hotel California, but what if there is a karaoke version of Hotel California and a cover version by another band? Without artist and album references, that DJ is not going to know what he's actually grabbing, right? If his intention is to have people search for songs, it gets really difficult at that point. There could be another song where actually the couple very specifically doesn't want for their wedding playlist the most popular version of some song. Maybe they want a cover version of a song, right? And so we can think of databases sometimes very simply, but generally speaking, in the real world, making air quotes there, we do have to think about data in a larger context. And in this case, the context is we really need to have album and artist information as well. And so you can see here that I do in fact have tables for album and artist. And these, the records that we have here all relate to each other. So a track has a track ID, and this is simply which number track it is within an album. And then it also has this artist ID and album ID. So artist, if we look at that table, has an artist ID and then an artist name, right? So we can see we have these different groups right here. So artist ID of 1 means that it's a song by the artist New Order. So if we go to track right here, if we look at some of the pre-filled data, I can see here that In a Lonely Place has an artist ID of 1. Therefore, artist ID of 1 means that this is a New Order song right here. Further, it has a album ID field right here. So album ID then, of course, would mean that if we go to album, there's going to be a certain number of albums right here, as you can see that there is. There's names, and then they also have artist IDs. So this album ID of 1, if I look right here, I could see that this is an album ID of 1, means that this is the group New Order, and the album, because its ID of 1, is Retro John McCready Fan, right? So these all loop together. So what we're going to look at in the third and final video of this series then is how we actually tie all this together within rack forms. Again, I really want to stress that when it comes to writing very simple data, as long as we have rack forms, it's very easy just to right-click, select MySQL, SQL Plus Automator, fill in the fields as we need, and then just choose from one of these buttons to create database tables for us in the SQL Plus insert items, right? We don't need to know MySQL or any SQL for that matter to write to a database table. It's very simple in rack forms. The problem with that is most of the time we do need to have at least some cognizant representation of what our data is. Otherwise, in the end, it'll probably be of little use to the person that you're creating the software for, right? You can create a list of songs for somebody. You can create a list of customers, but unless you're relating those songs to artists and those customers to purchases, your database isn't going to be worth a heck of a lot. And so it's kind of unfortunate it has to be that way. I wish there was an easier way. But again, hopefully this video will shed a little bit on that process of tying those two together. So in the third video, that is what we're going to do. We're going to write to these database tables right here in a way that actually makes sense.